Tonight, we are going to explore the terrifying scientific paradox that an advanced civilization could have existed on Earth 50 million years ago, only to have every physical trace of their empire ground into molecular dust by the very planet they tried to conquer. We build with the quiet, arrogant certainty that we are the first intelligence to ever dominate this planet, and that our monuments will stand as eternal testaments to our genius. But if an empire exactly like ours had risen, spanned the globe, and suddenly collapsed tens of millions of years ago, we wouldn't find a single buried city. We wouldn't find ancient weapons, buried statues, or massive foundations. Everything they ever built would have been actively dismantled, consumed, and erased at an atomic level by the Earth itself, but they wouldn't vanish entirely. They would leave a shadow, a faint, bizarre chemical whisper, locked deep inside the ancient rock. And the most unsettling part of this mystery isn't just a theory, it is that scientists have already found that exact chemical whisper. Modern science is capable of looking up into the night sky and capturing the glow of light from galaxies that are 13 billion light-years away. We can capture photons that traveled across the entire age of the universe, threading through clouds of gas and the gravitational pull of countless worlds, only to arrive perfectly intact at a mirror floating in the cold vacuum of space. The universe holds on to its past with extraordinary, almost perfect fidelity. It is a museum of deep time. Meanwhile, the planet beneath our feet is doing the exact opposite. Earth does not preserve its history. This creates a profound and terrifying asymmetry. The universe remembers, but our own home is an active, relentless eraser. We call ourselves the apex of evolution, the inevitable conclusion of 4.5 billion years of biological trial and error. If the entire history of the Earth were compressed into a single 24-hour day, human civilization would not even occupy the final second before midnight. We would appear in the final fraction of that second. Yet, we genuinely believe in that quiet, confident way that civilizations tend to believe things about themselves, that the story of Earth's mind begins exclusively with us. But complex animals have roamed this planet for over 500 million years. Mammals have existed for more than 200 million years. We went from stone tools to splitting the atom and launching satellites in a little over 12,000 years. When you look at the hundreds of millions of years where the biological raw material for intelligence was present, the assumption that we are the only species to ever cross that threshold stops looking like science and starts looking like human vanity. In 2018, this exact discomfort was dragged out of the fringes and placed firmly into the mainstream scientific spotlight. Two scientists with unimpeachable institutional credentials published a formal scientific inquiry into this terrifying blind spot. Adam Frank, an astrophysicist at the University of Rochester, and Gavin Schmidt, a climate scientist and director of the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, published their paper in the International Journal of Astrobiology. They called it the Silurian Hypothesis. They did not write it to claim that ancient reptilian architects secretly built our world. Their question was purely mechanical, deliberately narrow, and deeply unsettling. If an industrial civilization had existed on Earth tens of millions of years prior to our own, would our current scientific methods even be capable of detecting it? The answer they arrived at was not reassuring. To understand why their conclusion shook the foundations of how we view paleontology, you must understand what Earth actually does to the things resting on its surface. The planet is not a passive stage where history merely plays out. It is a furnace. The entire oceanic crust of the Earth turns over on a cycle of roughly 200 million years. New crust wells up as magma at mid-ocean ridges pushes outward and eventually dives back beneath the continental plates at subduction zones, plunging into the interior of the planet where extreme temperatures and pressures reduce everything to molten rock. Every single piece of ocean floor currently on this planet is, in geological terms, brand new. Nothing older than 200 million years survives there. It has all been consumed and reissued. On the continents, the destruction is driven by the sky. Erosion strips material from the highlands, glaciers grind bedrock into fine powder, and rivers carry the debris to the sea. Mountain ranges are worn completely flat, and coastlines advance and retreat by hundreds of miles. Now apply that relentless, merciless process to a civilization. Imagine a city the scale of Los Angeles or Tokyo existing 50 million years ago. Within tens of thousands of years of abandonment, the glass shatters, the concrete cracks as plant roots infiltrate the foundations, and the steel rusts away into the soil. Within a few million years, the rubble is buried under accumulating sediment. Within tens of millions of years, that sediment has been compressed into rock, tilted by tectonic forces, eroded from above, or pulled directly back into the mantle. The probability that any physical artifact survives to the present day, a fragment of shaped metal, a piece of concrete, a recognizable structural element, is not small. It is effectively zero. It is converted at a molecular level into sedimentary layers that are chemically indistinguishable from ordinary rock. Even our plastics, which we view as an eternal curse upon the environment, degrade within a few 100,000 years under ultraviolet radiation and microbial activity. They disappear long before the next ice age completes its cycle. The physical absence of evidence, therefore, is not evidence of absence. The geological record was designed by the laws of physics to systematically destroy the evidence. Frank and Schmidt realized that searching for physical structures was entirely the wrong approach. The only thing that could possibly survive 50 million years of geological processing is a whisper of anomalous chemistry. If a predecessor civilization existed, we would only find an unusual shift in the ratio of carbon isotopes. We would find peculiar concentrations of heavy metals appearing in sedimentary layers where they simply have no business being. We would find a thin, strange band of chemistry, perhaps a few centimeters thick, sandwiched between hundreds of meters of perfectly ordinary rock. It would look exactly like the fingerprint of a massive natural carbon release event. Finding a civilization in the deep past wouldn't look like uncovering a buried temple. It would look like finding a highly anomalous, localized chemical spike. And the most horrifying realization to emerge from this entirely theoretical model is that geologists do not need to search for this chemical spike. They don't need to hypothesize about its existence. They already know exactly where it is, because buried 56 million years deep in the Earth's crust, staring back at us with a chemical fingerprint that precisely matches the output of a global industrial empire, is a scar that no natural explanation has ever been able to fully close. 56 million years ago, the Earth caught fire. It was not a fire of flame and ash, but a fire of pure, overwhelming heat, a catastrophic planetary fever that left a scar so deep in the geological record that every core sample pulled from the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean or drilled from the Arctic permafrost tells the exact same terrifying story. Scientists call this event the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, deliberately clinical phrasing usually shortened to the PETM, and the name makes it sound manageable, like a neat chapter in a geology textbook. But the PETM is not just a chapter, it is a crime scene. It is the most mysterious and consequential climate disruption of the last 66 million years, and the closer researchers look at the evidence buried in the rock, the more uncomfortable the details become. To understand the magnitude of what happened, you have to look at the sheer, staggering volume of the anomaly. Over a geologically brief window, a blink of an eye that may have been as short as a few thousand years, an enormous quantity of carbon was violently injected into the Earth's atmosphere. Estimates vary, but the current geological consensus places the total somewhere between 3,000 and 13,000 petagrams of carbon. A single petagram is 1 billion metric tons. To put that terrifying number into perspective, humanity has released roughly 600 petagrams of carbon since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. The PETM delivered at minimum 5 times that amount, and potentially up to 20 times more, in a window of time that barely registers on a geological scale. The result was an apocalyptic planetary transformation. Global average temperatures skyrocketed by 5 to 8 degrees Celsius. That range might sound modest until you consider that the climate difference between an Alaskan winter and a Florida summer is roughly that same magnitude. The Earth was fundamentally reorganized. The Arctic Ocean, a place we associate with crushing ice and freezing winds, reached surface temperatures of 23 degrees Celsius or 73 degrees Fahrenheit. It became subtropical. Palm trees grew in Wyoming, and relatives of the crocodile hunted in the Arctic Circle. But beneath the waves, the warming turned the oceans into a suffocating nightmare. The deep ocean lost much of its oxygen in a process called anoxia, resulting in the largest deep-sea mass extinction event in over 90 million years. The sheer volume of carbon dioxide dissolving into the seawater spiked the ocean's acidity so drastically that the calcium carbonate shells of marine organisms literally dissolved while they were still alive. The planet spent the next 200,000 years recovering from this sudden, violent blow. This is where the story shifts from a fascinating geological catastrophe to a haunting paradox. We know the carbon spiked, and we know the planet burned. But what actually released up to 13 trillion tons of carbon in a geological instant? To answer that, you have to understand how geologists read the fingerprints of deep time. Carbon is not just a uniform element, it comes in different isotopic forms. The two most stable are carbon-12, which is the most common, and carbon-13, which is slightly heavier. The ratio between these two isotopes is not random. It varies systematically depending on where the carbon originally came from. Volcanic carbon, pulled from deep within the Earth's mantle, carries a very specific, heavier isotopic ratio. But biological carbon, carbon from living organisms, plants, animals, and bacteria, carries a completely different ratio. Life on Earth is fundamentally lazy. During photosynthesis and biological growth, living things preferentially absorb the lighter carbon-12 because it requires less energy to process. This creates a permanent biological fingerprint. Whenever you look at a piece of wood, a field of grass, or an ancient deposit of coal, oil, and natural gas, you are looking at matter that is heavily enriched in carbon-12. Fossil fuels are nothing more than ancient biological life compressed over millions of years. When you burn them, you release that specific biological carbon back into the atmosphere, creating what scientists call a sharp negative shift in the carbon isotope ratio. When researchers drilled deep into the 56 million-year-old rock layers of the PTM, they expected to find the heavy geological signature of a massive natural disaster. Instead, they found a massive global spike of carbon-12. The carbon that flooded the atmosphere and nearly choked the planet to death did not carry the signature of deep Earth rock. It carried the precise, undeniable fingerprint of burned biological material. The signal recorded in the bedrock looks exactly, flawlessly identical to the chemical footprint of an industrial civilization digging up its planet's fossil fuels and combusting them on a global scale. For 30 years, this horrifying anomaly has sat quietly in published, peer-reviewed literature. Mainstream science has desperately tried to explain it away using entirely natural mechanisms, but every time they run the numbers, the natural suspects fall critically short. The most common explanation points to massive volcanic eruptions in the North Atlantic igneous province, a period of intense activity as Greenland and Europe tore apart. But volcanic carbon carries the heavy isotopic signature, completely contradicting the massive influx of light, biological carbon, found in the PETM rock layers. Volcanoes may have provided an initial spark, but they fundamentally cannot account for the biological fingerprint. The second major suspect is methane hydrates. These are vast, ice-like structures buried in deep-sea sediments that trap enormous quantities of biological methane. Because methane is created by the breakdown of organic matter, its carbon carries the correct light isotopic fingerprint. The theory suggests that a slight warming of the oceans caused these frozen methane deposits to violently melt, releasing a massive greenhouse gas cascade into the atmosphere. But when researchers model the volume of methane necessary to cause the PETM, the math refuses to balance. Even if every known and estimated methane hydrate reservoir on the planet destabilized simultaneously, it would still fail to produce the 13,000 petagrams of carbon recorded in the stone. Even when geochemists combine the volcanic eruptions, the melting methane, and hypothetical shifts in the Earth's orbit, the models break down. They account for most of the event, but they leave a massive, unexplained missing volume of carbon that simply cannot be sourced. In the rigorously documented world of geology, the distance between explaining most of the data and explaining all of the data is not a minor footnote. It is exactly where the greatest paradigm shifts in human knowledge are waiting to be found. This unexplained remainder is not just statistical noise, it is a blaring alarm that our natural models are fundamentally incomplete. This brings us back to the chilling theoretical framework proposed by NASA-affiliated scientists Adam Frank and Gavin Schmidt. Remember their central question: if an advanced, industrialized civilization existed 50 million years ago, how would we know? They proved that cities, steel and plastics would be ground into absolute nothingness by the Earth's tectonic recycling. The only surviving trace, the single solitary ghost that would outlast 50 million years of geological violence, would be a massive, rapid injection of isotopically light carbon. Frank and Schmidt were not writing their paper about the PETM, but the theoretical fingerprint they designed for a vanished, planet-burning empire is a precise, categorical match for the exact data geologists have been staring at for 3 decades. We are faced with a 56-million-year-old crime scene featuring a biological carbon footprint, an impossibly fast release rate, and a sheer volume that completely exceeds the planet's known natural boundaries. The academic silence surrounding this convergence is deafening. In the normal realm of science, when a peer-reviewed paper exposes an anomaly this significant, the community rushes to test it, to challenge it, or to break it. But the suggestion that the PETM could represent the exhaust fumes of an ancient doomed civilization is so professionally dangerous, so hostile to the established dogma of human uniqueness, that it has been met with quiet avoidance. It is far safer to file the anomaly under natural causes requiring further study than to risk a career asking if the Earth has hosted this parasitic cycle of industrialization before. But the rock does not lie. It does not care about academic tenure or human vanity. It simply records. And what it recorded 56 million years ago is the exact same catastrophic story that we are currently writing into the Earth's crust today. We are mining ancient biological life, burning it in our engines and factories, and flooding the atmosphere with the exact same carbon-12 isotope spike. We are driving global temperatures upward, acidifying the oceans and triggering a mass extinction event. We are not just creating an analog to the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. We are chemically replicating it with terrifying precision. If the 56-million-year-old scar in the Earth was merely a chaotic natural disaster, that is frightening enough. It means the planet is capable of sudden, violent shifts that wipe out ecosystems in a geological heartbeat. But if that perfectly matched biological carbon fingerprint belongs to something else, something that extracted, built, consumed, and died, then we are staring directly at our own inescapable reflection. Yet, if this ancient civilization did exist and burned itself to death, where is the body count? Surely, if an intelligence was trapped on a rapidly heating, suffocating planet, they wouldn't just vanish into a chemical ledger, they would have tried to adapt. They would have left a biological shadow. And as we dig past the chemistry and look directly into the fossil record, we find that the biological anomalies of the PETM are even more horrifying than the carbon. When you stare at the 56-million-year-old chemical scar of the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, you are forced to confront a glaring physical void. If an industrial civilization was responsible for pumping up to 13 trillion tons of isotopically light carbon into the atmosphere, where is the body count? If an empire spanned the globe, extracted resources at a planetary scale, and burned its world to a suffocating fever, they could not have simply vanished into a ledger of carbon data. Chemistry tells us that a fire occurred. It measures the heat of the flames and the volume of the ash. But carbon isotopes do not build cities, they do not invent technologies, and they do not experience the psychological terror of watching the sky turn into a furnace. A civilization is made of biology. It is made of living, breathing, consuming organisms. The orthodox view of paleontology conditions us to look for the dead. We expect to find the bones, the fossilized remains of the architects, the physical residue of the beings who held the tools. But as we have already established, the Earth is a remorseless grinding machine. Tectonic subduction, chemical weathering, and the crushing weight of deep time do not merely erase skyscrapers. They erase the bones of the people who built them. Fossilization is an incredibly rare, almost miraculous geological accident. It requires rapid burial in fine sediment, perfect anoxic conditions, and a stable chemical environment to slowly replace organic material with minerals. The vast, overwhelming majority of all biological life that has ever existed on this planet rotted away without leaving a single trace. If an entire civilization rose and fell in the geologically brief span of a few thousand years, the exact window in which the PETM carbon spike occurred, the statistical probability of finding a fossilized individual from that specific culture is vanishingly small. If the physical buildings are ground to dust and the physical bodies of the inhabitants are consumed by time, it seems as though the biological trail goes entirely cold. But that assumption relies on an outdated, fundamentally limited way of looking at the past. To find the ghost of an ancient intelligence, a new discipline is emerging at the bleeding edge of science, a framework that forces us to stop looking for broken pillars and shattered bones. Researchers are beginning to call this new approach biocosmic archaeology. Biocosmic archaeology operates on a chilling, undeniable premise. You do not need to find the physical remains of an organism to prove that it existed. You only need to find the unnatural disruption it caused to everything else. An advanced technological civilization, regardless of what it looks like or how it functions, fundamentally alters the ecological systems it inhabits. It does not live in harmony with the wild, it manages the wild. It introduces invasive species across continents, it eliminates natural predators, it homogenizes the biosphere, and it violently restructures the predator-prey dynamics of the entire planet. These profound artificial disruptions leave signatures in the fossil record. Biocosmic archaeology searches for anomalous local extinction patterns, sudden shifts in species composition that do not match ordinary climate models, and bizarre reshufflings of food webs that appear and disappear within a razor-thin stratigraphic window. It looks for the biological footprint of an intelligent agent bending the natural world to its will. When we stop looking for the chemistry of the PETM and start looking for its biocosmic footprint, the geological record stops whispering and starts screaming, because 56 million years ago, the biosphere did not just experience a warming event, it experienced a catastrophic, unnatural reorganization. And the horror of that reorganization begins where the light cannot reach, in the deepest, coldest, most stable environment on the planet. Before the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, the deep ocean was a haven of stability. For tens of millions of years, the abyss had been cold, predictable, and teeming with specialized life. But as the massive injection of biological carbon flooded the atmosphere, the oceans began to absorb the heat. Global temperatures skyrocketed, and the deep ocean warmed by 4 to 5 degrees Celsius, or roughly 7 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit. That number might seem small to a surface dweller, but in the abyss, it was an apocalyptic shock. Warm water cannot hold as much dissolved oxygen as cold water. The heat fundamentally altered the ocean's density layering, weakening the great thermohaline circulation, the underwater conveyor belt that distributes oxygen to the depths. As the circulation slowed and the waters warmed, the deep ocean began to suffocate. Scientists call this process anoxia, but the clinical term entirely fails to capture the sheer, planetary-scale nightmare of what was happening. Across the globe, oxygen levels plummeted. The deep sea became a stagnant, toxic void. Billions of organisms perfectly adapted to the cold, oxygen-rich currents found themselves trapped in a suddenly alien world, gasping for breath in an environment that was actively betraying them. But suffocation was only the first phase of the execution. The massive volume of carbon dioxide dissolving into the seawater triggered a violent chemical reaction, lowering the ocean's pH and causing severe global ocean acidification. For microscopic shell-building plankton known as benthic foraminifera, this was a death sentence. These organisms rely on a delicate chemical balance to extract calcium carbonate from the water to construct their protective shells. As the oceans turned acidic, That process became biologically impossible. The acidic waters literally began to dissolve their shells while the organisms were still alive inside them. Entire taxonomic groups of these ancient, resilient creatures, species that had survived the asteroid impact that killed the dinosaurs just 10 million years earlier, were entirely wiped out. The seafloor was transformed into a barren, lifeless wasteland. It was the single largest deep-sea mass extinction event in over 93 million years. This is not the signature of a slow, natural evolutionary transition. The suddenness of the anoxia, the violence of the acidification, and the targeted annihilation of the deep-sea food web look exactly like the catastrophic downstream effects of an intelligence dumping its toxic, industrialized exhaust into the biosphere. It is a biocosmic shadow, an ecological crime scene of unimaginable proportions. Yet as horrifying as the oceanic suffocation was, the most unsettling biological anomalies of the PETM did not happen in the dark of the abyss. They happened in the light of day, on the terrestrial surface, among the direct evolutionary ancestors of the very animals we recognize today. When paleontologists examine the fossil record of the continents during this 56-million-year-old fever, they find that terrestrial ecosystems did not completely collapse in the same way the deep ocean did. Instead, the landscape was entirely, rapidly reshuffled. In places like the Bighorn Basin of Wyoming, the entire mammalian community turned over. Species that had thrived for millions of years simply vanished, and bizarre new species abruptly appeared. This brings us to the most disturbing biological mystery of the entire era, the mammalian dwarfing event. As the global temperatures spiked, the mammals of the PETM underwent a sudden, radical, and universally uniform physical transformation. Across multiple, completely independent evolutionary lineages, mammals rapidly shrank. Early horses, which were already small, forest-dwelling creatures, became even smaller. Early primates, the distant evolutionary cousins of our own lineage, underwent significant diversification but critically reduced their body mass. You can literally track this phenomenon in the sediment layers. As you move up through the strata corresponding to the peak of the thermal maximum, the fossilized teeth of these mammals become progressively, undeniably smaller. Mainstream biology offers two perfectly rational natural explanations for this dwarfing anomaly. The first is simple thermal dynamics. In a world that is rapidly boiling, a smaller body size is highly advantageous. A smaller creature has a higher surface area to volume ratio, allowing it to dissipate heat much more effectively than a large, bulky animal. Shrinking was a desperate evolutionary strategy to avoid overheating in a subtropical Arctic. The second explanation involves starvation. As carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere surged to unprecedented heights, plant life went into overdrive. Plants grew faster and larger under the heavy CO2 blanket, but this hypergrowth came at a severe biological cost. The vegetation became nutritionally hollow. The plants contained significantly less protein and fewer essential nutrients per bite. The herbivores of the PETM were surrounded by an ocean of green leaves, yet they were slowly starving to death. Under the crushing pressure of declining nutritional value, evolutionary selection ruthlessly favored smaller bodies that required fewer daily calories to survive. When the thermal maximum finally ended and temperatures and carbon levels slowly returned to normal after 200,000 years, the dwarfing abruptly reversed. Within a few 100,000 years, the descendants of these shrunken mammals grew back to their pre-event sizes, and in some cases grew even larger. It is a fascinating, terrifying glimpse into the mechanics of natural selection under extreme duress. But when you view this dwarfing event through the unsettling lens of biocosmic archaeology, the narrative shifts from fascinating to horrifying. Remember the central premise: if an advanced, industrialized civilization was trapped on this planet during the PETM, they would not simply stand by and watch the world burn. Intelligence does not passively accept extinction. A civilization capable of altering the global atmosphere would possess the agricultural and biological sophistication to fight back. As the planet warmed by 8 degrees Celsius, as the oceans turned to acid and the weather patterns violently reorganized, traditional agriculture would have collapsed. The crops they relied on would wither in the unprecedented heat, or lose their nutritional value in the carbon-choked air. The massive, resource-heavy livestock they depended on would become impossible to feed and water. If you are the architects of a dying empire and your population is starving, what is your immediate logical response? You manage the collapse. You genetically engineer or selectively breed your food sources to require less energy. You downsize. Could the sudden, across-the-board dwarfing of multiple mammalian species during the PETM be more than just a natural evolutionary response to heat and poor nutrition? Could it be the surviving biological footprint of a desperate, starving civilization selectively breeding their livestock, their draft animals, and their companions to be smaller, more efficient, and less calorically demanding? We assume the tiny horses and shrunken primates found in the Bighorn Basin were wild animals struggling against the elements. But what if they were the biological technology of a predecessor species trying to engineer their way out of an apocalypse? When humanity transitions from hunter-gatherers to an agricultural society, we leave a massive biocosmic shadow. We take wild wolves and selectively breed them over generations into hundreds of specialized, often much smaller breeds. We take wild grasses and engineer them into uniform, high-yield crops. We violently alter the genetic destiny of the species around us to serve our caloric needs. If a future paleontologist 50 million years from now were to look at our current fossil layer, they would find bizarre, highly unnatural distributions of genetically modified chickens, cows, and dogs. They would see a sudden, global homogenization of biology that makes absolutely no sense under the normal rules of Darwinian evolution. The mammalian dwarfing of the PETM and the sudden reshuffling of the terrestrial food web perfectly mimic the signature of an intelligence violently intervening in the biosphere. It looks like domestication. It looks like the frantic, centralized management of a collapsing ecological portfolio. The fact that these mammals shrank in unison across multiple lineages, precisely tracking the peak of the carbon excursion, and then magically grew back to normal the moment the carbon levels dropped, is the exact pattern you would expect to see if a managed agricultural system was implemented during the crisis and then abandoned when the civilization finally failed. This is the ultimate horror of the biocosmic shadow. We are searching the rock layers for the ruins of their cities, completely blind to the fact that their ruins might be written into the DNA of the fossil record. We are looking for shattered concrete, while the true architecture of their empire was the engineered, manipulated, and ultimately discarded biological organisms they left behind. But if they did engineer their biosphere to buy themselves time, if they did shrink their livestock and manage the collapse, it clearly wasn't enough. The carbon continued to pour into the atmosphere, the heat continued to build, and the deep oceans continued to suffocate. The surface of the planet was rapidly becoming fundamentally incompatible with advanced biological life. The storms would have been biblical in scale, the droughts continent-wide, the heat waves lethal. At a certain point, a technologically capable civilization realizes that the surface of the Earth is no longer a habitat. It is a hostile execution chamber. They realize that they cannot engineer the atmosphere fast enough to reverse the damage, and they cannot breed their food sources small enough to outpace the starvation. They are faced with the terrifying reality that the sky they once conquered is now trying to kill them. So, what does an intelligence do when the sky turns to fire and the air turns to poison? They don't just lay down and die in a single day. A civilization that possessed the power to extract billions of tons of carbon from the Earth would possess the engineering capacity to retreat from the catastrophe. They would do the only logical thing a trapped species can do. They would look at the blistering, inhospitable surface of their dying world, and they would realize that their only chance for survival lay in the exact opposite direction. They wouldn't look up, they would look down. And as the planet entered a 200,000-year nightmare of heat and suffocation, they would take their technology, their desperation, and their engineered biology, and they would descend into the dark. 200,000 years. Say that number out loud, let it sit in the room with you, and try to genuinely comprehend the weight of it. We measure our own recorded history in mere centuries, occasionally stretching back a few millennia, to the ancient Sumerians or the builders of the pyramids, and we call that an eternity. Our entire industrial age, the era of steam engines, splitting the atom, and walking on the moon, spans barely 300 years. Modern human beings, as a distinct anatomical species, have existed for roughly 300,000 years. Now imagine a planetary apocalypse that does not pass in an afternoon, or a generation, or even a millennium. Imagine an apocalypse that lasts for 200,000 years. When the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum was triggered 56 million years ago, it pushed the Earth's climate so far beyond its natural equilibrium that it took a span of time roughly equivalent to the entire existence of our species for the system to finally stabilize and heal. The planet spent 200,000 years suffocating, burning, and desperately trying to scrub the 13 trillion tons of isotopically light carbon out of its atmosphere. The geological record treats this as a recovery period, a clinical phase of chemical weathering where the carbon was slowly drawn back down into the Earth. But the term recovery is an insult to the unimaginable horror of what was actually happening on the surface of the planet during those 2,000 centuries. To understand the sheer, unadulterated nightmare of the PETM surface, you must abandon every preconceived notion you have about the Earth's geography. The world was fundamentally, violently reorganized. Global average temperatures skyrocketed by 5 to 8 degrees Celsius. That might sound like a mild summer adjustment until you realize that the difference between the crushing, continent-spanning glaciers of an ice age and the mild interglacial period we enjoy today is roughly that exact same magnitude. The PETM delivered that transformation not as a slow, gradual shift, but as a violent shock to the entire globe simultaneously. The Arctic Ocean, a region we conceptualize as a barren, freezing expanse of crushing ice, transformed into a subtropical swamp. Surface temperatures in the Arctic reached 23 degrees Celsius, or 73 degrees Fahrenheit. That is warmer than the average ocean temperature off the coast of Miami today. The ice caps vanished completely. Palm trees sprouted and thrived in the high latitudes of Wyoming. Relatives of the modern crocodiles swam through the Arctic Circle, hunting in waters that should have been solid ice. The poles became humid, sweltering greenhouses, while the equatorial tropics became virtually uninhabitable. Ocean surface temperatures off the coast of West Africa reached a blistering 36 degrees Celsius, or 97 degrees Fahrenheit. At those temperatures, the fundamental building blocks of marine ecosystems simply shut down and die. But the true execution chamber of the PETM was located beneath the waves. As the oceans absorbed the massive influx of biological carbon, the water warmed and expanded. Warm water physically cannot hold as much dissolved oxygen as cold water. The vast underwater conveyor belts, the deep ocean currents that circulate oxygen down into the freezing abyss, began to slow down and eventually collapsed entirely. The deep sea was plunged into a state of anoxia, a clinical, sterile word for mass suffocation. Billions of organisms that had evolved in the cold, stable, oxygen-rich depths suddenly found themselves gasping in a stagnant, toxic void. It was the largest and most devastating deep-sea mass extinction event of the last 93 million years. And the water was not just suffocating, it was highly corrosive. The sheer volume of carbon dioxide dissolving into the seawater triggered a violent chemical reaction, forming carbonic acid and dropping the ocean's pH at a terrifying rate. For microscopic, shell-building plankton like benthic foraminifera, this acidification was a planetary death sentence. These creatures extract calcium carbonate from the water to build their protective armor, but in the acidic oceans of the PETM, that biological mechanism was rendered impossible. The acidic waters literally dissolved their shells while the organisms were still alive inside them. On land, the catastrophe was equally absolute. Rainfall patterns did not just shift, they violently and unpredictably reorganized. Regions that had been lush, stable forests for millions of years were subjected to continent-spanning droughts, while other areas were hammered by unprecedented biblical storms. The terrestrial landscape was entirely reshuffled. The vegetation, supercharged by the massive blanket of atmospheric carbon, grew rapidly but became nutritionally hollow, forcing the rapid, desperate dwarfing of mammalian species who were surrounded by a sea of green leaves but slowly starving to death. Now, introduce the variable that makes this event the most terrifying mirror in the geological record. What if the 13 trillion tons of biological carbon that triggered this 200,000-year apocalypse did not come from a random pulse of volcanic magma or a sudden, unexplained melting of ocean ice? What if it came from the exhaust pipes, the engines, the smokestacks, and the extraction industries of a predecessor civilization? A technological civilization would not just sit and watch the sky turn to fire. They would have possessed the instruments to measure the carbon accumulating in their atmosphere. They would have deployed scientists and researchers to study the shifting isotope ratios, to map the declining ocean pH, and to warn their leaders about the approaching thresholds. They would have seen the crisis coming, but as the geological record proves, whether natural or artificial, the event did not stop. The carbon kept pouring in, the feedback loops activated, and the warming became self-sustaining. When a highly intelligent, technologically capable species realizes that their planetary habitat is actively trying to kill them, they do not simply accept extinction in a single day. They adapt, they engineer. But when the atmosphere itself becomes a suffocating, superheated blanket, and the oceans turn to corrosive acid, you can no longer engineer the surface. The storms are too violent, the heat waves are too lethal, the crop failures are too absolute. If you are the architects of a dying empire and your models definitively prove that the planet will not be safe to inhabit for another 200,000 years, you are faced with a horrifying realization. Up is death, out is death. The only direction left to go is down. Imagine the psychological terror of that civilizational pivot. Imagine the desperate, frantic transition from a society that conquered the skies and mapped the continents to a society digging its own mass grave just to survive. A technological civilization trapped in a planetary furnace would turn their engineering prowess toward the deep Earth. They would begin excavating massive subterranean complexes, sealed environments capable of sustaining thousands of people in total isolation. They would need to bore deep enough into the bedrock to escape the lethal surface temperatures and the continent-spanning wildfires. This would not be a temporary bunker. This would be a multi-generational exile. They would have to engineer artificial biospheres, utilizing hydroponics and genetically modified dwarfed livestock to maximize caloric efficiency in a zero-light environment. They would need to build complex ventilation systems that could scrub the toxic, carbon-choked air from the surface before it circulated through their underground cities. They would have to harness geothermal energy, tapping into the heat of the Earth to power their artificial lights and their water filtration systems, completely cutting themselves off from the dying sun above. We cannot find these 56-million-year-old bunkers today. As we have established, the relentless grinding machinery of plate tectonics, the subduction zones, and the sheer crushing weight of deep time have recycled the continental crust, collapsing those hypothetical subterranean cities and grinding their steel, concrete, and bones into molecular dust. The physical architecture of their descent is gone forever, swallowed by the Earth's mantle. But what if the physical buildings are not the only things that survive a catastrophe? What if trauma is inherited? What if the psychological instinct to flee beneath the Earth when the sky becomes hostile is a reflex encoded into the biological memory of the planet itself? To understand the terrifying implications of this, we do not have to look back 56 million years. We only have to look back a few thousand. Because in the volcanic heartland of modern Turkey, in a region known as Cappadocia, archaeologists have discovered something that defies every conventional explanation of human history. They have discovered a sprawling, interconnected network of over 200 underground cities. The largest of these currently known to us is called Derinkuyu. When a man knocked down a basement wall in 1963, he did not find a root cellar. He found a passageway that led downward into an 18-story deep subterranean metropolis. Derinkuyu was meticulously carved from soft volcanic rock, descending roughly 85 meters or 280 feet into the crushing dark. It was not a cave system. It was a highly engineered, deliberately planned survival bunker capable of housing up to 20,000 people, along with their livestock, their food supplies, and their culture for extended periods of absolute isolation. Mainstream archaeology offers a comfortable, rational explanation for these staggering subterranean feats. They argue that the people of the region built these cities to hide from invading armies. They point to the historical record of Hittites, Persians, Romans, and Arab raiders sweeping across the landscape. The local population, facing a cavalry raid, would retreat into the earth, roll the massive multi-ton circular stone doors across the corridors, and wait for the enemy to pass. But when you analyze the engineering of Derinkuyu, the conventional explanation shatters under the weight of logical scrutiny. If you are hiding from an army of men on horseback, you might dig 3 levels down, perhaps 5. 3 levels of narrow, defensible corridors are more than enough to deter any human military force. No attacking army in the history of human warfare has ever laid siege to a position 18 stories underground. The logistics of pursuing an enemy into the pitch-black depths of the earth, where a single defender in a narrow tunnel can hold off 100 soldiers, are strategically impossible. An invading army does not chase you down 85 meters. They simply block the exits, poison the air shafts, and wait. So why did they build 18 stories down? You do not dig 18 levels deep, coordinate the excavation of millions of cubic feet of rock, engineer a ventilation system capable of supporting 20,000 breathing humans and their animals at the bottom of the earth, and construct multi-year food storage facilities just to hide from men with swords. You go that deep because the additional distance from the surface serves a completely different purpose. You go that deep because you need more rock between you and whatever is happening above you. You build a completely self-contained, isolated environment with an independent water supply and air filtration shafts because the threat you are facing is not an occupying army. The threat is the surface of the earth itself. You build Derinkuyu because the surface has become fundamentally incompatible with biological survival. You build it because the air has turned to poison, the sky is raining ash, the temperatures are lethal, or the heavens themselves are raining fire. When we look at Derinkuyu, we are looking at the exact same civilizational response that a technologically advanced species would have been forced to adopt during the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. It is the architecture of planetary reset. It is the physical manifestation of a traumatized intelligence realizing that the sky has betrayed them. The people who carved Derinkuyu did not do so on a whim. The engineering required to map the water table, calculate structural load-bearing pillars in the dark, and maintain breathable airflow across an 85-meter vertical drop is not the result of panicked improvisation. It is systematic, inherited knowledge. It is the application of a survival protocol that was developed by people who knew exactly what the sky was capable of doing. And the terrifying truth is, Derinkuyu is not an isolated anomaly. It sits in the exact same geographic and temporal neighborhood as Göbekli Tepe, a site we will explore later, built by people who seemingly emerged from the ashes of a completely different, much younger cataclysm. Both sites represent a shared, culturally embedded understanding that the surface of the world cannot be trusted. If an industrial civilization caused the Petm 56 million years ago, their 200,000-year descent into the bedrock was the ultimate, horrific consequence of their own progress. They engineered their way into the dark, sealing themselves behind stone and steel, listening to the muffled roar of a boiling planet above them. We will never know how long they survived down there. We will never know if their artificial lights eventually flickered and died, if their subterranean hydroponics succumbed to disease, or if the slow, crushing madness of living in a sealed tomb for thousands of generations stripped away their humanity until whatever crawled in the dark was no longer recognizable as the civilization that built the tunnels. What we do know is that the carbon spike in the rock eventually peaked, the oceans eventually cooled, the Earth, indifferent to the suffering of the intelligence trapped beneath its crust, slowly scrubbed the atmosphere clean through hundreds of thousands of years of chemical weathering. When the planet finally returned to equilibrium, the surface was green again. But whoever went down into the dark never came back up to reclaim it. They faded into the geological noise, leaving behind only the chemical ghost of their greed. But the Earth did not stop. Millions of years passed. New species evolved, continent configurations shifted, and the stage was set again. We believe that we are the only actors to have walked onto this stage since the ice retreated. But as we move forward in time from the 56-million-year-old crime scene to a much younger, much sharper wound in the bedrock, we find that the pattern repeats, because exactly 12,800 years ago, the sky fell again, and this time it left much more than just a whisper of carbon. It left the physical wreckage of a shattered world, and it forced the survivors to carve the memory of their destruction into the very bones of the Earth. Tonight, we are going to abandon the silent chemistry of the deep past and dig into a much younger, fresher wound in the Earth. A planetary reset exactly 12,800 years ago that left behind not just chemical whispers, but the shattered physical wreckage of a world that vanished overnight. Imagine a world slowly waking up from an ice age where massive glaciers are retreating and an apex culture of human hunters is spreading across an entire continent. Everything feels like progress, like a spring that will last forever. And then, in the span of a single human lifetime, the sky catches fire and the spring violently dies. We are taught that human history is a slow, steady climb out of the caves, guided by the gentle hand of gradual climate shifts. But the Earth's crust holds a terrifying secret that mainstream archaeology has spent decades trying to ignore. It is a boundary line carved in soot and shattered rock, marking the exact moment when the heavens detonated with the force of tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, wiping out the largest animals on 4 continents and erasing an entire human culture so completely that they became ghosts in their own landscape. 12,800 years ago, the world was healing. The great ice sheets that had buried much of North America and northern Europe under kilometers of crushing glacial weight were in retreat. Temperatures had been rising steadily for thousands of years, and the ecosystems of the Pleistocene were thriving. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths the size of automobiles, short-faced bears and saber-toothed cats roamed across a vast, opening landscape. In North America, a highly sophisticated culture of human hunters had mastered this domain. We call them the Clovis people, named after the distinctive, beautifully crafted stone spear points they left behind. These were not struggling nomads clinging to the edge of survival. They were a successful, well-adapted population that had spread across an entire continent. Their fluted stone tools represent some of the finest prehistoric technology ever discovered, so precise that modern knappers struggle to replicate them. Everything in their world was moving in a direction of continuation and progress. And then, in what the geological record suggests was the span of a few decades, or perhaps even a few years, everything simply stopped. The temperatures that had been gently dismantling the ice age violently reversed course. The planet was plunged back into a brutal, near-glacial deep freeze that would persist for over 1,000 years. In parts of Greenland, ice core data indicates that annual average temperatures dropped by an astonishing 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. Scientists call this sudden return to winter the Younger Dryas, named after a small Arctic wildflower whose pollen suddenly reappeared in European sediments as the cold reclaimed the Earth. But the cold was not the only thing that arrived. Death arrived on a scale that defies natural gradual explanation. Across North America, 35 genera of large animals went extinct in a catastrophic geological instant. The mammoths, the mastodons, the dire wolves, the American lions and camels, all gone. And it was not just North America. Synchronously, the woolly mammoth populations in Eurasia crashed. The megafauna of South America died off. Large fauna in Australia showed sudden disruption. 4 continents, separated by oceans and thousands of miles of ice, lost their largest animals at the exact same moment. And the Clovis people vanished with them. Their distinctive, carefully crafted tools completely disappear from the archaeological record at the exact same stratigraphic horizon as the megafaunal collapse. It was not a slow cultural evolution or a gradual migration. It was a full stop. For decades, the mainstream scientific consensus has offered a comfortable, entirely terrestrial explanation for this mass death. They argue that human hunters overhunted the megafauna and simultaneously a massive pulse of glacial meltwater from a collapsing North American ice lake flooded into the Atlantic. This freshwater pulse supposedly shut down the ocean's warm currents, triggering the sudden freeze. This theory works neatly on paper, but it requires an impossible coincidence. Human hunting pressure is inherently local. A tribe in Arizona overhunting mastodons possesses no mechanism to simultaneously wipe out mammoths in Siberia or giant sloths in South America. Overhunting takes generations and leaves a trail of shifting strategies and gradual decline. The Clovis disappearance shows none of this. And while a meltwater pulse explains regional cooling, it does not explain the synchronized, violent extinction of apex species across multiple disconnected hemispheres. In 2007, a team of researchers looked closer at the boundary layer dating to exactly 12,800 years ago, and what they found shattered the meltwater hypothesis. Buried in the Earth at dozens of sites spread across North America, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East was an unnatural sedimentary stripe containing materials that are not produced by floods, storms, or shifting ocean currents. They found nanodiamonds. These are microscopic crystals of carbon, some only a billionth of a meter across, that can only form under conditions of unimaginable pressure and extreme heat. You cannot make nanodiamonds with a volcanic eruption, and you certainly cannot make them with a flood. There is only one known natural process that generates them at this scale, the high-velocity impact of a cosmic object. Alongside the nanodiamonds, the researchers found magnetic microspherules, tiny metallic balls that form when rock or soil is instantly vaporized, thrust into the air, and re-solidifies as it falls back to Earth. They found elevated concentrations of iridium, a rare element on Earth's surface, but a highly common ingredient in asteroids and comets. They found shocked quartz, which are grains of mineral bearing internal fracture patterns that require pressures far exceeding terrestrial volcanic capabilities. You only find shocked quartz at the bottom of impact craters or beneath the detonation sites of nuclear weapons. And finally, mixed into this exact same layer across 3 separate continents, they found staggering quantities of soot and charcoal. This was not a localized campfire. This was the chemical residue of continent-spanning wildfires burning simultaneously. The physical evidence forms a pattern that points to a single, terrifying conclusion. Exactly 12,800 years ago, a large, fragmented extraterrestrial object, most likely a comet, detonated in the atmosphere or slammed directly into the northern ice sheet. The energy released in that geological instant would have been equivalent to tens of thousands of nuclear weapons firing simultaneously. Imagine the sheer horror of that moment, a shockwave traveling at hypersonic speeds across the continent, instantly flattening forests and shattering the glaciers. A thermal pulse so blindingly hot that it ignited the landscape for hundreds, perhaps thousands of miles in every direction. Millions of tons of vaporized rock, superheated steam, and atmospheric debris were injected violently into the stratosphere, blocking out the sun. The sky turned black. The debris rained down globally within days, depositing that thin, irrefutable layer of nanodiamonds, iridium, and ash across 4 continents. The heat from the blast would have instantly destabilized massive sections of the Laurentide ice sheet. The resulting catastrophic volumes of meltwater surged into the North Atlantic, abruptly shutting down the ocean's thermohaline circulation and plunging the bruised, burning world into a 1,000-year winter. One single apocalyptic cause explains it all: the climate reversal, the widespread continental fires, the synchronous megafaunal extinction, and the abrupt, violent erasure of the Clovis culture. It is not a coalition of awkward coincidences, it is the fingerprint of a shattered sky. But for years, the mainstream scientific community violently rejected this hypothesis. Careers had been built on the meltwater theory. To accept a cosmic impact meant acknowledging that an entire generation of archaeological and climatological research was standing on an incomplete foundation. Critics demanded a smoking gun. If a comet hit the Earth with the force of a nuclear arsenal, they argued, Where was the crater? If it hit the ice sheet, wouldn't there be a massive scar in the bedrock beneath? In 2018, the ice finally yielded its secret. An independent team of researchers utilizing advanced airborne ice-penetrating radar peered deep beneath the glaciers of northwestern Greenland. Hidden beneath 3 kilometers, nearly a mile, of solid ice, they found the Hiawatha crater. It is a massive, circular depression carved directly into the bedrock, measuring an astounding 31 kilometers across. A hole in the earth large enough to comfortably swallow an entire major city, with a raised rim and a central peak characteristic of a high-velocity cosmic collision. The implications of an impact structure this enormous are staggering. A rock capable of carving a 31-kilometer crater would have instantly vaporized billions of tons of glacial ice upon impact. While debates regarding the exact dating of the Hiawatha structure are ongoing within the geological community, its mere existence decisively terminates one side of the argument. Massive, continent-shattering cosmic impacts in the North Atlantic are not hypothetical. They are physically documented realities. Furthermore, in 2025, researchers identified another crater-like depression in Louisiana, nearly 1,000 feet across, containing the exact same isotopic markers: shocked quartz, magnetic microspherules, and high-temperature glass, stamped with the precise 12,800-year-old date. The comet was not a single bullet. It was a fragmented shotgun blast that caught the Earth as it turned. We are forced to confront an incredibly uncomfortable reality about the fragility of human progress. The people who lived through this, the human beings who watched the sky detonate and their ecosystems burn, were not primitive ape men. The Clovis hunters and whatever coastal megacultures existed along the now submerged continental shelves were sophisticated, organized, and deeply embedded in their environment. Their disappearance was not a gradual fading into the background of history. It was a violent amputation of human potential. And this brings us to the psychological crux of the Younger Dryas reset. When a catastrophe of this magnitude strikes, it does not just destroy the bodies and the buildings, it destroys the transmission of knowledge. It removes enough people fast enough that whatever civilization manages to crawl out of the ashes is forced to rebuild from a drastically diminished foundation. But humanity is resilient. Intelligence is stubborn. If you are among the few who survive the thermal pulse, the floods, and the suffocating winter that follows, you realize with absolute clarity that your world is a fragile illusion. You realize that the knowledge you hold is the most vulnerable resource on the planet. You cannot write it down on animal skins or wood. The fire will take it. You cannot build a wooden library. The ice and time will crush it. If you want to warn the future, if you want to leave a timestamp of the exact moment the sky fell, you have to write it in the only language the Earth cannot easily erase. You have to carve it into massive, monolithic stone, and you have to bury it deep underground so the sky can never touch it again. There is a fundamental misdirection at the heart of modern archaeology, a blind spot so massive that it has completely warped our understanding of human origins. When we search for the remnants of our earliest ancestors, we look in the dry valleys of the continents, we dig into the highlands, and we sift through the dust of arid deserts. But this approach ignores the most basic, undeniable law of human civilization. Human beings do not build their greatest empires in the mountains. Civilizations cluster where life is abundant. They build along the lush coastlines, they settle at the mouths of great river deltas, and they thrive in the estuarine zones where fresh water meets the sea. Throughout every recorded period of human history, the largest, most complex, and most interconnected settlements have always been maritime and coastal. There is absolutely no logical reason to believe that the humans of the Ice Age behaved any differently. During the last glacial maximum, when millions of cubic miles of water were locked up in crushing continent-spanning ice sheets, the global sea level was approximately 120 meters lower than it is today. 120 meters is roughly the height of a 40-story building. Because the oceans were so drastically reduced, the coastlines of every single continent extended outward for miles, exposing vast, sprawling plains of incredibly fertile land. These exposed continental shelves were not barren wastelands. They were lush, temperate zones, moderated by their proximity to the ocean. Rivers flowed across them, dense forests grew upon them, and animals grazed across plains that simply no longer exist. In Europe, a massive stretch of walkable, habitable terrain known as Doggerland connected the island of Britain to the continental mainland. In Asia, the vast Sundalen Shelf connected Southeast Asia to Indonesia. The Bering Land Bridge formed a massive, dry superhighway between Asia and North America. If an advanced, sophisticated culture existed during the Pleistocene, a culture capable of deep-sea navigation, monumental architecture, and complex social organization, they would have built their megacities on these exact continental shelves. They would have lived where the resources were richest and the climate was most forgiving. But between 15,000 and 7,000 years ago, the ice began to melt, and the Earth underwent a geographical transformation of unimaginable apocalyptic violence. The sea level did not rise as a slow, creeping tide that gently nudged populations inland. The warming of the planet triggered catastrophic sudden releases of enormous water volumes from collapsing ice sheets, resulting in terrifying episodes that geologists refer to as meltwater pulses. During one of these devastating events, known as Meltwater Pulse 1A, which occurred roughly 14,000 years ago, the global sea level surged by an astonishing 20 meters in the span of just a few centuries. Another violent pulse appears to have coincided exactly with the Younger Dryas catastrophe 12,800 years ago, triggering rapid regional flooding across multiple hemispheres simultaneously. Try to genuinely comprehend the psychological terror of living through this geographical execution. You are standing on a coastline in 12,000 BCE. Your community, your culture, and your entire conceptual universe have been anchored to this landscape for generations. The rivers, the forests, the burial grounds, and the trading routes are all fixed points in a world you believe is permanent. And then the sea simply begins to move inward. The beach creeps closer. The low-lying hunting grounds flood and refuse to drain. The freshwater springs near the coast suddenly turn brackish and then entirely to salt. In the span of a single human lifetime, a person would watch the ocean actively swallow the land where they were born. Within a few generations, the cities, the temples, and the coastlines of their ancestors would be sitting in darkness at the bottom of the ocean. The sheer scale of the landmass consumed by the rising oceans during this 8,000-year period is almost impossible to visualize. The total land area lost to the rising water was roughly equivalent to the combined landmass of Europe and North America. Let that fact sink in. A continental expanse of prime, habitable, highly productive land, equal to two of the largest continents on Earth today, was completely erased from the map. The North Sea filled in, drowning Doggerland forever. The Black Sea, which was once a smaller freshwater lake, was violently inundated with salt water when the rising Mediterranean breached the Bosphorus threshold, displacing every community that had settled along its shores. When a catastrophe of this magnitude consumes a civilization, the physical architecture is lost to the water, but the trauma is encoded into the survivors. The descendants of these drowned megacultures were forced to flee inland, carrying with them the memories of a world that no longer existed. Over thousands of years, these memories were compressed, mythologized, and passed down in the only format that pre-literate societies possessed: oral tradition. The agonizing generational process of coastal loss was collapsed into the narrative simplicity of a single, world-ending deluge that occurred in a single night. This inherited trauma is the only rational explanation for the most widespread, persistent narrative convergence in all of human culture. Across every inhabited continent on the planet, separated by vast oceans, thousands of miles and thousands of years of absolute isolation, humanity has told the exact same story. Anthropologists and folklorists have catalogued over 500 distinct, independent flood myths. These stories are found in the traditions of the Hopi, the Cree, and the Inuit in North America. They are recorded in the Aztec descriptions of a fourth age of the world that ended in a catastrophic flood, and in the Mayan Popol Vuh. They are found in Chinese foundational mythology, in the folklore of Japan and Korea, among the island cultures of the Pacific, and across sub-Saharan Africa. Mainstream academia attempts to explain this staggering global phenomenon through the lens of cultural convergence. They argue that because all human settlements require water, all human settlements experience local flooding, and therefore the flood myth is simply a universal human response to a generic natural hazard. This explanation is comfortably dismissive, but it completely falls apart when you analyze the structural architecture of the stories themselves. These 500 independent cultures did not just invent a generic story about a river overflowing its banks. They independently developed an identical, highly specific narrative sequence. The sequence always features a previous, highly developed world that existed before the water. It features a divine or supernatural warning delivered to a chosen individual. It features the urgent construction of a vessel for preservation. It details the preservation of animals. It describes a catastrophic inundation, so violent that even the mountains are threatened. It features the vessel coming to rest on high ground. It features the releasing of birds to search for dry land. And it ends with the survivors establishing a new beginning, effectively restarting civilization on the other side of the apocalypse. Consider the sheer statistical impossibility of this convergence. If 500 people in 5 different countries, speaking 5 different languages with absolutely no access to each other, all claimed they saw a red car hit a utility pole on a Tuesday morning, you would not call it a coincidence. You would be forced to conclude that they all witnessed the exact same event. The oldest written iteration of this trauma was not recorded in the Bible. It was etched into clay tablets by the Sumerians, the builders of the first recognized cities in Mesopotamia. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero seeks out Utnapishtim, the ancient survivor of the Great Deluge. Utnapishtim explains how the god Ea warned him in secret, whispering through the walls of a reed house, instructing him to tear down his home and build a massive boat to save the seed of all living things. The storm that followed raged for 6 days and 7 nights, rising so high and violently that even the gods themselves cowered in terror. When the waters receded, Utnapishtim released a dove, a swallow, and finally a raven before the boat settled upon a mountain. In ancient Greek mythology, the sky god Zeus decides to wipe out the corrupt human race with a massive deluge. Deucalion and Pyrrha survive by seeking refuge in a chest that floats on the rising waters, eventually coming to rest on a mountaintop where they repopulate the earth. In Hindu tradition, the god Vishnu warns the sage Manu of the approaching devastation. Manu constructs a boat, fills it with seeds and animals, and is towed through the catastrophic waters by a giant fish. These are not religious allegories randomly invented by disconnected primitive minds. They are the fossilized, traumatized memories of the global meltwater pulses that drowned the Ice Age world. And the proof that these are literal, geographical memories rather than spiritual metaphors has been stunningly confirmed in Australia. The Aboriginal Australians possess oral traditions that are among the oldest continuously maintained records on the planet. Their stories describe a great water that covered the land, reshaping the coastlines and drowning entire regions. What makes the Aboriginal accounts absolutely terrifying to mainstream historians is that these stories contain specific geographic descriptions of bays, headlands, islands, and freshwater sources that are currently completely submerged beneath the ocean. When researchers cross-reference these oral descriptions with modern bathymetric surveys, sonar mapping of the Australian continental shelf, they found exact correspondences between the features described in the myths and the actual physical topography sitting on the ocean floor at depths of up to 120 meters. These are not vague thematic similarities. They are highly precise geographical maps preserved solely through spoken word. The implications of this shatter the established boundaries of human capability. It means that an oral tradition was transmitted across approximately 400 generations, surviving every social disruption, every linguistic evolution, and every cultural transformation over 10,000 years, while retaining enough high-fidelity precision to perfectly describe a coastline that has been underwater for longer than written history has existed. Modern humans struggle to accurately recall the plot of a movie they watched a week ago, yet pre-literate communities utilize storytelling as a highly advanced hard drive to maintain a flawless geographical record of a drowned world. If the flood myths are the software of a destroyed civilization, preserving the memory of the catastrophe, then the hardware, the physical ruins of their cities, their temples, and their infrastructure is sitting exactly where the myths say it is. It is sitting at the bottom of the ocean. This brings us to the ultimate infuriating blind spot of modern science. The vast majority of the inhabited landscapes of Ice Age humanity are currently under 30 to 120 meters of ocean water, buried beneath 12,000 years of accumulating marine sediment. We have successfully produced complete, high-resolution surface maps of the Moon. We have mapped 70% of the Martian surface in stunning detail. Yet the ocean floor of our own planet, the exact location where the megacities of our ancestors would logically have been built, has been mapped at a comparable resolution over merely 20% of its area. Marine archaeology is chronically underfunded, logistically complex, and structurally ignored by a scientific establishment that prefers the safety and convenience of terrestrial excavations. We are literally searching for the origins of civilization on the high ground, entirely ignoring the fact that the civilizations of the Pleistocene were maritime empires. We have spent billions of dollars deploying rovers to search for microscopic fossilized bacteria on a dead planet, while willfully refusing to systematically scan the continental shelves of our own world for the drowned architecture of our predecessors. But on the rare occasions when we do look beneath the waves, the ocean refuses to keep its secrets. High-resolution sonar surveys of the western coast of India, in the Gulf of Cambay, have identified massive geometric structures resting 40 meters below the surface, displaying regular angles and organized arrangements that do not conform to natural geology. Off the southern coast of Japan, the massive terraced rock formation known as the Yonaguni Monument features right-angle cuts and symmetrical channels that fiercely defy conventional geological explanations. Submerged Neolithic settlements with organized stone walls have been found off the coasts of Israel, Albania, and southern France. These are not isolated curiosities, they are the upper tips of a submerged iceberg. We are looking at a crime scene where the ocean itself is the perpetrator, hiding a landmass the size of Europe and North America beneath a crushing, impenetrable blanket of water. The Earth is an active, relentless eraser, and the rising seas of the meltwater pulses were the mechanism that wiped the slate clean. The physical evidence of this prior intelligence was swallowed by the dark, leaving us to dig through the dirt of the mountains, completely unaware that the true epicenter of human potential was drowned 12,000 years ago. But intelligence is resilient. The survivors who watched the water consume their megacities knew that the surface of the world could never be trusted again. They knew that the sky was capable of detonating and the oceans were capable of rising, and they understood that if they wanted to leave a record of what happened, they could not build it on the coastlines. They would have to seek higher ground. They would have to carve their warnings into the deepest bedrock and bury their messages beneath millions of tons of earth, engineering bunkers that could survive the wrath of a hostile planet. In 1963, a man living in the quiet Turkish town of Derinkuyu decided to renovate his home. He took a sledgehammer to a basement wall, expecting to find more compacted earth or perhaps a shallow, forgotten crawl space. The stone gave way, but what waited behind it was not dirt. It was a profound, unnatural void. It was the kind of darkness that carries a faint, continuous current of cool air from somewhere impossibly far below. A darkness that does not behave the way an ordinary enclosed cellar should. He pushed his way through the shattered masonry and stepped into a passageway. That passageway led into a room, which led to another downward-sloping tunnel, which led to another room, spiraling endlessly into the crushing depths of the Earth. What that unnamed homeowner had accidentally breached was not a natural cave system. He had discovered one of the most staggering, inexplicable engineering marvels of the ancient world. He had stumbled into an entire subterranean metropolis, meticulously carved from the soft volcanic tuff of the Cappadocia region. The complex he uncovered extends approximately 85 meters, or 280 feet, straight down into the bedrock, spanning an astonishing 18 individual levels. It had been completely sealed and forgotten for centuries. When archaeologists finally entered the dark to map the site, they realized Derinkuyu was not merely a temporary shelter, it was a highly engineered, deliberately planned survival bunker. At full capacity, this subterranean city was designed to house up to 20,000 people simultaneously, along with their livestock, their food supplies, and their entire societal infrastructure for extended periods of absolute isolation. The complex contained a staggering array of civic and domestic spaces, communal kitchens, water wells that reached the deep water table, massive storage rooms, stables for animals, wine and oil presses, meeting halls, schools, and chapels. The security of the complex was absolute and uncompromising. Throughout the tunnels, massive circular stone doors, each weighing several hundred kilograms, could be rolled across the narrow corridor entrances. These multi-ton monolithic barriers were engineered with a specific, terrifying purpose. They could only be sealed from the inside, making them virtually impossible to open from the outside. Every single floor could be locked down independently. If the upper levels were somehow breached, the population could simply retreat deeper into the abyss, rolling the massive stones across the tunnels behind them as they descended. But the true genius of Derinkuyu, the detail that elevates it from a curiosity to an impossible anomaly, is the air. If you put 20,000 breathing human beings along with herds of livestock into a sealed rock cavern 85 meters underground, they will quickly suffocate in their own carbon dioxide. Yet the ventilation system at Derinkuyu represents an engineering achievement of staggering complexity. A network of primary and secondary air shafts runs from the surface all the way down to the deepest levels of the city, perfectly maintaining breathable air throughout the entire 18-story complex. This is not the kind of knowledge that emerges from panicked improvisation or accumulated folk wisdom about digging holes. Maintaining adequate, life-sustaining airflow at a depth of 85 meters across a sprawling, multi-level grid requires a deep, mathematical understanding of how air pressure and fluid dynamics behave across vertical distances. It requires knowing, before the very first shaft is ever dug, exactly where the intake and exhaust points need to be positioned, what dimensions the shafts must maintain to sustain the necessary throughput, and how the entire system will perform under varying conditions of temperature and human occupancy. To build Derinkuyu without a comprehensive blueprint and advanced surveying equipment would be like trying to excavate a 5-mile tunnel from both ends and expecting them to meet perfectly in the middle. The engineering coherence of the city implies that whoever designed it held the complete, unified vision of the complex in their minds before the first stone was ever struck. And Derinkuyu is not an isolated anomaly. It is merely one node in a sprawling subterranean empire. The Cappadocia region contains over 200 currently identified underground settlements. Some are modest, extending only a few levels into the earth, while others rival Derinkuyu in sheer, incomprehensible scale. Just 5 miles away lies the vast underground city of Kaimakli, and there is compelling evidence suggesting that Kaimakli and Derinkuyu may have once been connected by an underground tunnel stretching nearly 9 kilometers. In 2015, during the construction of a housing project near the town of Nevşehir, surveyors discovered yet another underground metropolis beneath a hilltop castle. Initial radar surveys of the Nevşehir site suggest it could be significantly larger than Derinkuyu, extending over 100 meters in depth and covering an area approaching 5 million square feet. When you look at this staggering volume of excavated rock across an entire region, you are forced to ask a very simple question. Why? Why would human beings ever need to go that far underground? The mainstream archaeological consensus offers an explanation that feels comfortable, rational, and entirely terrestrial. They attribute the earliest excavations to the Phrygians, a culture that inhabited the region in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, and argue that the complexes were later expanded by Byzantine Christians. According to this narrative, these 200 cities were built as temporary refugees from invading armies. Because Cappadocia sits at the historical crossroads of ancient empires, the local populations allegedly used these tunnels to hide from Hittites, Persians, Romans, Arab raiders, and Mongol cavalry sweeps. When an occupying army appeared on the horizon, the people would retreat into the earth, roll the stone doors shut, and simply wait for the danger to pass. This explanation is presented as settled historical fact. It accounts for the physically soft volcanic rock, which is easy to carve, and it aligns with written historical records of Byzantine populations utilizing caves during times of conflict. But when you subject this mainstream narrative to basic logical and military scrutiny, it instantly collapses. If you are a community trying to hide from an army of men on horseback, the defensive logic of underground concealment works perfectly at 3 or 4 levels of depth. 3 levels of narrow, defensible corridors are more than enough to deter any historical human military force. No attacking army in the recorded history of human warfare has ever laid siege to a position 18 stories underground. The logistics of pursuing an entrenched enemy into the pitch-black depths of the earth, where a single defender in a narrow tunnel can easily hold off 100 heavily armed soldiers, are strategically impossible. An invading army does not chase you down 85 meters into the dark. They simply find the ventilation shafts on the surface, block them, poison the air, and wait for you to suffocate. You do not coordinate the excavation of millions of cubic feet of solid rock, engineer a master-planned ventilation system capable of supporting 20,000 people, and construct massive multi-year food storage facilities just to hide from men with swords. You do not dig 18 stories deep to hide from a passing cavalry raid. At a certain point, the extreme depth stops serving the purpose of evading a human enemy, and it begins serving a completely different, far more terrifying purpose. What does going 85 meters underground actually give you? It gives you distance. It gives you millions of tons of solid rock between you and the surface of the planet. You only build a completely self-contained, isolated environment with an independent water supply and air filtration shafts if the threat you are facing is the surface of the Earth itself. You build 18 stories down because the surface has become fundamentally incompatible with biological survival. The people who designed Derinkuyu were preparing for a scenario where the outside world was not occupied by soldiers, but was physically lethal to inhabit. You build this deep when the air has turned to poison. You build this deep when the sun is blocked out by continent-spanning ash clouds for months or years at a time. You build this deep when the temperatures have dropped so violently that agriculture is impossible, or when the heavens themselves are raining fire. Cappadocia is a highly active volcanic region. The very tough rock that allowed them to carve these cities was deposited by ancient volcanic eruptions that blanketed the landscape in meters of pyroclastic material. The people living there would have had a deep, culturally embedded understanding of what the Earth is capable of doing to the sky. In a scenario where a massive eruption coats the world in toxic ash, destroys the food chain, and makes the air unbreathable, taking your entire society deep underground with sealed ventilation and stored supplies is not paranoia. It is rational, applied engineering. But the architecture of Derinkuyu points to something even darker than a regional volcanic winter. It points to a systematic, inherited civilizational response to the cyclical, planetary-scale cataclysms that have repeatedly reset the timeline of life on Earth. Think back to the 56-million-year-old crime scene of the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. We established that if an industrialized civilization was trapped on a rapidly heating, suffocating planet where the oceans turned to acid and the surface burned, their only logical path for survival was to abandon the surface and engineer their way downward. Derinkuyu is the exact physical manifestation of that theoretical descent. It is the architectural blueprint of planetary reset. Now fast forward to the Younger Dryas catastrophe exactly 12,800 years ago. When a fragmented comet detonated over the northern ice sheets, it unleashed a hypersonic thermal pulse that ignited continental wildfires, instantly melted glaciers, and plunged the bruised, burning world into a 1,000-year winter. The people who survived that apocalyptic event watched the sky detonate and the oceans rise. They learned, in the most horrific way possible, that the surface of the world is a fragile illusion and that the sky can and will betray them. Derinkuyu sits roughly 600 kilometers to the west of Göbekli Tepe, falling perfectly into the same geographic and temporal neighborhood as the people who emerged from the ashes of the Younger Dryas impact. While mainstream dating places the upper levels of these underground cities in the Iron Age, the deepest, most ancient foundations of the complex display a completely different construction style and spatial philosophy, suggesting that later cultures simply found and expanded upon a massive subterranean bunker that was already there. Over 200 underground cities across a single region is not the result of one community making an unusual decision about local defense. It represents a massive, culturally embedded strategy for civilizational survival. It is a shared, deeply traumatized understanding, transmitted across generations, that you cannot trust the sky. When we look down into the 18-story abyss of Derinkuyu, we are not looking at a medieval hiding place. We are looking at the inherited reflex of a species that knows exactly what the universe is capable of doing to this planet. Human beings ran into the dark to escape a world that was trying to erase them. And the memory of that erasure, of the sky falling, the air burning, and the oceans rising up to swallow the continents, did not stay buried in the dark. It was carried forward, whispered through thousands of generations, until it became the most widespread and persistent story ever told by human tongues. What do you do with the knowledge that the world around you is actively trying to erase you? If you are among the fractured, traumatized remnants of humanity who watched the sky detonate 12,800 years ago, you do not just survive physically, you survive with information. You know exactly what the sky looked like when it ended. You know the sequence of the catastrophe, and you understand with a terrifying absolute clarity that the knowledge you hold is the most fragile resource on the planet. You cannot write it down on animal skins or wood because the fire will consume it. You cannot build a wooden library because the ice and time will crush it. If you want to leave a warning for whoever manages to inherit the Earth, you have to engineer a message in the only format the planet cannot easily digest. You have to carve it into massive, monolithic stone, and you have to make it so complex and so large that whoever comes next cannot possibly miss it. In the dry, rolling hills of southeastern Turkey, roughly 15 kilometers northeast of the ancient city of Sanliurfa, sits a limestone ridge that farmers have worked around for centuries. The locals called the artificial, gently rising mound Göbekli Tepe, or Potbelly Hill. In 1963, a joint archaeological survey team from Istanbul University and the University of Chicago visited the site, noticed the worked stones pushing through the thin soil, classified the area as a medieval cemetery, and simply moved on. For 31 years, one of the most paradigm-shattering architectural complexes in the history of the human race sat in plain sight, entirely ignored by a scientific establishment that assumed they already knew exactly what belonged in that era. It wasn't until 1994 that a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt arrived on the hilltop, looked at the exact same stone fragments the previous survey had catalogued, and immediately recognized that they were not medieval. They were prehistoric, and they were old in a way that the word old completely fails to capture. When excavations began the following year, what emerged from the dirt actively broke the established timeline of human civilization. Schmidt's team uncovered massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing nearly 16 feet tall and weighing up to 20 tons. These monolithic stones were not rough-hewn. They were meticulously arranged in precise circular enclosures and covered in highly sophisticated, intricate relief carvings. The stone surfaces swarmed with depictions of foxes, lions, boars, snakes, scorpions, and vultures alongside abstract geometric symbols. On several pillars, long, stylized human arms were carved running down the sides, with hands clasped at the front, turning the towering stones into faceless, monolithic sentinels standing in the dark. To date, over 20 distinct circular enclosures have been identified, yet geophysical surveys reveal that the excavated areas represent a mere 5% of what still remains buried underground. The sheer scale of the complex spans an estimated 90,000 square meters, but it is not the size or the artistry of Göbekli Tepe that terrifies the mainstream academic consensus. It is the date stamped on its foundations. Radiocarbon dating places the oldest structures at Göbekli Tepe at approximately 9,500 BCE, that is 11,500 years ago. To understand the impossibility of that number, you must hold it against the reference points of everything we are taught about human progress. Göbekli Tepe is 6,000 years older than Stonehenge. It is 7,000 years older than the Egyptian pyramids. It predates every known permanent human structure, every written language, and every wheel by a margin so massive it completely shatters the boundaries of our historical framework. According to every textbook and every established model of human development, the people alive 11,500 years ago were simple hunter-gatherers. They were supposed to be nomadic tribes roaming the landscape, possessing no agriculture, no domesticated animals, no permanent villages, and no administrative hierarchy capable of organizing large-scale labor. Yet, these supposed nomads quarried 20-ton limestone blocks from bedrock hundreds of meters away. They shaped them with mathematical precision, transported them across uneven terrain without the aid of wheels or draft animals, and erected them in perfect circular alignments. Furthermore, computer modeling published in the Cambridge Archaeological Journal has revealed that the three main enclosures at Göbekli Tepe are not randomly positioned. They are connected by a flawless equilateral triangle, a geographic relationship that proves the entire massive complex was conceived as a unified master plan design before the very first stone was ever cut. This level of architectural cohesion is not the result of nomadic hunters randomly piling rocks over centuries. It requires surveying, advanced geometric knowledge, and an organized command structure capable of directing a workforce of hundreds of people for decades. And a workforce of that size requires an enormous, stable food supply. The orthodox narrative dictates that agriculture came first, which allowed for food surpluses, which allowed for permanent settlements, which finally produced the spare time and labor necessary to build temples. Göbekli Tepe violently reverses this entire sequence. The temple came first. The desire to build this massive stone complex was so urgent, so overwhelmingly important, that it forced a hunter-gatherer population to invent agriculture just to feed the labor force. Just 20 miles from Göbekli Tepe, geneticists have traced the world's oldest domesticated strains of wheat, dating to roughly 500 years after the temple's construction began. The paradox is undeniable. Humanity did not organically invent farming and then decide to build a monument. Humanity was desperately driven to build a monument and engineered farming as a biological supply line to achieve it. But what could possibly motivate a population to undertake such a staggering, grueling endeavor? The answer lies in the exact timing of its construction. The oldest structures at Göbekli Tepe date to 11,500 years ago. The younger Dryas, the 1,000-year deep freeze triggered by the catastrophic comet impact we explored earlier, officially ended approximately 11,600 years ago. The gap between the end of the apocalypse and the beginning of the construction is practically non-existent. As soon as the long, suffocating winter broke and the world began to warm again, someone immediately began building with a level of geometric sophistication that implies the architectural knowledge was not being newly discovered. It was already there. It was inherited from something that came before. Göbekli Tepe is not the slow, fumbling attempt of primitive humans trying to build their first permanent structure. It is the frantic, highly organized application of surviving knowledge by people who had just watched a far more advanced world burn to ash. And they did not just build a monument, they built a hard drive. They built a message designed to communicate across deep time, utilizing a language that does not depend on evolving dialects or cultural context. They utilized the only universal reference system available to a traumatized intelligence: the sky. Among the dozens of monoliths, one specific stone holds the key to the entire complex. It is known as Pillar 43, or the Vulture Stone. The relief carvings on this pillar are dense and unusual, featuring a vulture with one outstretched wing holding a round object, a scorpion below it, a headless human figure, and various other animals arranged around abstract symbols. For decades, archaeologists dismissed this as a generic mythological scene or a shamanic hunting ritual. But in 2017, researchers from the University of Edinburgh applied a completely different analytical framework. They hypothesized that the animals on Pillar 43 were not literal creatures, but representations of star constellations mapped precisely against the night sky. Utilizing advanced astronomical software capable of rewinding the precession of the Earth's axis to see the exact positions of the stars in deep antiquity, they searched for a match. The configuration carved onto the Vulture Stone was not a random myth. It was a perfect, flawless map of the night sky, and the specific astronomical arrangement encoded on the pillar corresponded to one exact date, approximately 10,950 BCE. That date is not arbitrary. Within the margin of precision available, 10,950 BCE aligns perfectly with the onset of the Younger Dryas. It is the exact timestamp of the comet impact. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were not decorating their walls with hunting stories, they were carving a date stamp of the apocalypse. They were recording the exact moment the sky fell, the moment their previous world was violently amputated from history. They encoded this memory into 20-ton blocks of solid limestone, using the geometric positioning of the stars, ensuring that any future civilization possessing basic astronomical mathematics would be able to read the warning. But the most horrifying realization of Göbekli Tepe is not what they built or even what they carved, it is what they did with it when they were finished. Around 8000 BCE, the people who had spent centuries quarrying, shaping, and erecting this massive 90,000 square meter complex made a decision that defies all conventional logic. They did not abandon the site to the elements. They did not let nature slowly reclaim it. Instead, they undertook a labor operation almost as staggering as the construction itself. They deliberately, systematically buried the entire complex. They hauled thousands upon thousands of tons of earth, limestone rubble, and animal bones to the ridge, dumping it into the enclosures until the towering pillars were completely swallowed by an artificial mountain. They sealed their masterpiece in darkness. Mainstream archaeology struggles to explain this, offering weak theories about ritual closure or concealing the site from rival tribes. But when you view Göbekli Tepe not as a temple, but as a technological vault engineered by the survivors of a cosmic reset, the burial makes perfect, terrifying sense. Why do you bury something you spent centuries building? You bury it to protect it. You bury it because you know exactly what the universe is capable of doing to the surface of this planet. The builders had inherited the trauma of the Younger Dryas. They knew that anything left exposed to the open sky was vulnerable to thermal pulses, continent-spanning firestorms, and catastrophic climate shifts. They understood that a structure above ground is temporary, but a structure buried under 3 meters of compacted fill can survive almost anything, including the complete collapse and resetting of whatever civilization comes next. Göbekli Tepe was never meant to be a temple for the living. It was designed from its very inception to be a time capsule for the future. The entire complex is a desperate message in a bottle, engineered to survive the wrath of a hostile planet and thrown into the dark ocean of geological time. They hid it underground so that one day, long after their own culture had faded into dust, another intelligence might dig it up, decode the stars carved on the Vulture Stone, and realize that the world has ended before. They built the ultimate warning, but as we move from the buried hills of Turkey to the scorching deserts of Egypt, we will find that Göbekli Tepe is not the only impossibly ancient marker left behind by the survivors. There is another guardian sitting on the Giza Plateau, and the scars carved into its body tell a story that terrifies modern geologists even more than the stars. We have just seen how the traumatized survivors of a shattered world buried their astronomical warnings beneath the rolling hills of Turkey, intentionally sealing their knowledge in the dark so that it might survive the wrath of a hostile planet. But Göbekli Tepe is not the only impossibly ancient marker left behind by the architects of the Ice Age. To find the next piece of this fractured, terrifying puzzle, we must travel 1,500 kilometers to the south, leaving the buried hills of Anatolia for the scorching, relentless sands of the Giza Plateau in Egypt. Here, sitting beside the Great Pyramid, is a structure that has watched the horizon with a cold, unchanging expression for thousands of years. It is the Great Sphinx, a massive monument featuring a human head resting upon the sprawling body of a lion, liberated entirely from the living bedrock of the plateau. It is the largest monolithic sculpture on Earth. Mainstream Egyptology offers a very neat, very comfortable story about this monument. They tell us that the Sphinx was carved around 2,500 years before the Common Era, during the reign of the pharaoh Khafre. They based this assertion on historical records, the monument's stylistic similarity to other Old Kingdom art, and its physical proximity to Khafre's pyramid. For the vast majority of the 20th century, this timeline was treated as absolute, settled historical fact. The narrative was closed, but there is a glaring, uncomfortable problem with this orthodox timeline, a problem that is not based on historical interpretation, missing scrolls, or cultural mythology. It is a problem based on the unforgiving, irrefutable laws of physics and geology. In 1990, a geologist named Robert Schoch arrived at the Giza Plateau. Schoch was not a fringe theorist or a mystic looking for lost civilizations. He held a doctorate in geology and geophysics from Yale University and was an associate professor at Boston University. He had been invited by independent researcher John Anthony West to conduct a routine, professional geological examination of the rock. Schoch fully expected to spend a few days confirming the conventional Old Kingdom dating and then go home. But when he stepped down into the Sphinx enclosure, the massive trench carved into the bedrock when the lion's body was originally freed from the surrounding limestone, he saw something that made him freeze. The Giza Plateau currently receives less than 25 millimeters of rainfall per year, an amount roughly equivalent to the height of a small stack of coins. It is one of the most thoroughly, relentlessly arid environments on the planet. For the last 5,000 years, the dominant weathering force on this plateau has been wind. Wind carries fine, abrasive sand, grinding horizontally across exposed limestone surfaces, cutting characteristic, unmistakable patterns into the rock. Wind erosion creates sharp, horizontal striations, angular edges, and surfaces worn flat and smooth in the direction of the prevailing airflow. But that is not what Schoch saw when he looked at the walls of the Sphinx enclosure. The erosion patterns carved deep into those walls were not horizontal. They were vertical. The limestone featured deep, rounded, undulating channels running from top to bottom, wider at the surface and tapering downward. To a trained geologist, these patterns are visually unambiguous. They are the unmistakable, undeniable physical signature of water. Specifically, they are the signature of sustained, heavy rainfall cascading down vertical surfaces over centuries, dissolving and carrying the limestone downward through repeated, relentless cycles of wetting and drying. When Schoch examined other structures on the Giza Plateau that were securely dated to the Old Kingdom, including rock-cut tombs carved from the exact same geological formation, they showed the expected sharp, horizontal desert weathering. They looked exactly like structures that had sat in the wind and sand for 4,500 years. The Sphinx enclosure, however, showed a fundamentally different profile. If both structures were carved at the same time, from the same rock, and exposed to the same environment, they should display the exact same erosion patterns. But they do not. This presents a timeline-shattering paradox. The Great Sphinx could not have been carved in 2500 BCE because Egypt has not experienced the kind of sustained, heavy rainfall required to produce those deep, vertical channels for at least 5,000 years. To find a climate capable of inflicting that specific type of water damage, you have to rewind the clock to a time known as the African humid period. Between roughly 12,000 and 5,000 years before the Common Era, the Sahara was not a desert at all. It was a lush, green savanna. Lakes dotted the landscape, massive river systems flowed where there is now only endless sand, and rainfall was incredibly abundant. If the deep, undulating vertical channels on the Sphinx enclosure were carved by centuries of heavy rain, then the monument must have been exposed to the sky before 5000 BCE. The physical condition of the rock demands that it was built at a minimum of 2,500 years before the official history of dynastic Egypt even begins, and potentially far older, dating back to the end of the last ice age. When Schoch presented his geological findings, the pushback from the mainstream archaeological establishment was immediate and fierce. Egyptologists argued that the Sphinx simply could not predate the Old Kingdom. Their primary objection was not a geological counter-argument, but an argument from consequences. If the Sphinx is 12,000 years old, they demanded, where is the civilization that built it? Where are their cities, their tools, their pottery, their waste middens? But this objection entirely ignores the terrifying reality of the planet we live on. As we have already established, a coastal civilization existing during the Ice Age, subjected to thousands of years of geological processing, violent climate disruption, and catastrophic meltwater pulses, would leave almost no recognizable surface trace. The vast majority of their settlements are currently sitting under tens of meters of ocean water, buried beneath the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean. The absence of corroborating archaeological evidence in the dry sands of Egypt is not evidence against Schoch's geological argument. It is exactly what the physics of an Ice Age cataclysm predicts. The only thing that would survive is a massive monolithic structure carved directly into the high bedrock of a plateau. To confirm his surface observations, Schoch conducted advanced subsurface seismic surveys around the base of the monument. By striking steel plates with sledgehammers to generate sound waves, he measured how deeply the weathering processes had penetrated the bedrock beneath the surface. The data revealed that the subsurface weathering at the Sphinx enclosure extended significantly deeper into the rock than the weathering at the nearby, securely dated Old Kingdom tombs. The bedrock itself confirmed what the walls were screaming. The Sphinx enclosure has been exposed to the elements for a substantially longer period of time than any officially recognized structure on the plateau. But what about the face? If the Sphinx was built by an ancient predecessor culture thousands of years before the pharaohs, why does the face look like an Egyptian king? Look closely at a photograph of the Sphinx, ignoring the face for a moment, and focus purely on the proportions. The body is massive, sprawling, and heavily eroded. The hunches, the paws, and the torso are scaled for a head that should be significantly larger and heavier than the one currently sitting on its neck. The current head is visibly, obviously, and disproportionately small relative to the enormous body. This disproportion is not a subtle artistic choice. It breaks the internal logic of the monument's own scale. The tool marks on the head are consistent with Old Kingdom craftsmanship, and they show relatively recent exposure to the elements. The tool marks on the body, however, show a completely different, vastly longer weathering history. The most logical, parsimonious explanation, an explanation endorsed even by many mainstream Egyptologists, is that the head was recarved. The original head, whatever it depicted, sat in the open air for thousands of years, enduring the brutal rains of the African humid period. It weathered so badly that it became heavily eroded and damaged. When the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom finally encountered the ancient water-scarred monument, Khafra simply claimed it as his own. He ordered his sculptors to carve his own image out of the damaged original stone. A head carved fresh from an already eroded original would naturally be much smaller because the sculptor was physically constrained by the degraded volume of material that was left. The recarved face is an Old Kingdom mask, hiding the true identity of a much older, profoundly traumatized guardian. And if the geology breaks the timeline, the astronomy shatters it completely. The architects of the deep past did not place their monuments randomly. The Sphinx faces due east. It is perfectly aligned to the exact point on the horizon where the sun rises on the morning of the spring equinox. But the sky is not a static painting. Due to a slow, predictable wobble in the Earth's rotational axis, a cycle of approximately 26,000 years known as precession, the specific constellation visible on the eastern horizon at sunrise on the spring equinox changes over time. The stars slowly drift like a massive celestial clock. If you look at the sky in 2500 BCE, the officially accepted date of the monument's construction, the constellation rising in that exact eastern position on the spring equinox was Taurus, the bull. A lion-bodied monument built to mark the equinox in the age of the bull makes absolutely no astronomical sense. But if you utilize advanced astronomical software to rewind the precession of the equinoxes, rolling the sky backward through deep time, the celestial clock eventually locks into a terrifying, perfect alignment. If you look at the eastern horizon on the spring equinox in the year 10,500 BCE, the constellation rising exactly due east was Leo, the lion. In 10,500 BCE, a massive lion-bodied monument oriented perfectly. Due east would have been staring directly at its own celestial mirror image rising above the horizon. So this is not a coincidence. The geological evidence of heavy rainfall erosion points to a construction date far older than 5000 BCE. The astronomical alignment of the lion facing the lion provides a highly specific, mathematically perfect timestamp of 10,500 BCE. These two entirely independent lines of scientific inquiry, one written in the physics of water and stone, the other written in the geometry of the stars, both point away from the pharaohs and directly back into the dark, violent era of the Ice Age predecessor culture. The date of 10,500 BCE places the creation of the Sphinx in the exact same temporal neighborhood as Göbekli Tepe. Whoever they were, the architects of this lost era possessed an astronomical sophistication capable of encoding specific deep time epochs into the orientation of massive monolithic structures. They possessed the engineering capacity to carve something out of solid bedrock that has withstood at least 12,000 years of planetary chaos, and they left no text, no name, and no recognizable city for us to connect them to. The Great Sphinx is not a tomb, and it was never meant to be a vanity project for an Egyptian king. Like the buried pillars of Göbekli Tepe, it is a surviving marker from a shattered world. It is a water-scarred guardian left behind by a civilization that watched the sky fall, survived the melting of the ice, and endured the terrifying rains that reshaped the continents. They left this lion facing east, a silent sentinel waiting for the celestial clock to turn, waiting for a future intelligence to recognize the water stains on its body and realize that human history is a reconstructed lie built on top of a forgotten apocalypse. For our entire journey, we have been looking backward, acting as detectives, sifting through the pulverized debris of deep time, searching for the ghosts of a vanished world. We have looked at underground survival bunkers, water-scarred monuments, mathematically precise astronomical warnings buried in the dirt, and the 56-million-year-old chemical scar of a planet that caught fire. We have been desperately trying to answer the question of what a previous civilization might have left behind. But there is a far more unsettling version of that exact same question, one that does not require a time machine or a single disputed piece of archaeological evidence. Instead of asking what the civilization before us left behind, we must turn the mirror entirely around and ask, what are we leaving behind? The answer is not abstract. It is already being permanently written into the rock. Take everything humanity has ever built. Every towering glass skyscraper, every sprawling concrete megacity, every interstate highway, every landfill, every nuclear power plant, and every cargo ship rusting in a harbor, the accumulated physical output of 8 billion people across over 2 centuries of industrial civilization. Now step away and let the relentless grinding physics of the Earth do exactly what it has done for 4.5 billion years. If you come back 50 million years from now, the cities are entirely gone. Without maintenance, the glass shatters, the concrete fractures and dissolves, and the steel rusts away into the soil. The continental plates shift, mountain ranges rise and erode, and tectonic subduction drags entire landmasses down into the mantle to be melted back into magma. After 50 million years of geological processing, the entire physical record of human civilization will be violently compressed into a single, thin band of sedimentary rock, perhaps only a few centimeters thick. You will find no recognizable foundations, no outlines of streets, and no indication that anything with a mind ever stood there. But that does not mean we will be invisible. We will leave a signature, a highly anomalous chemical whisper locked inside that thin layer of rock. And right now, we are actively embedding 4 incredibly specific, globally synchronous chemical signatures into the Earth's crust. The first signature is synthetic. Beginning around the year 1950, a thin but globally consistent layer of microplastic particles began accumulating in the sediment at the bottom of every ocean and every lake system on Earth. From the deepest trenches of the Pacific to isolated mountain lakes in the Himalayas that have never been touched by a human hand, the sediment cores all show the exact same unnatural signature. It is thin, and it will eventually degrade into simpler organic molecules over millions of years, but it will leave a distinct, measurable marker horizon of unusual hydrocarbons that is completely unlike anything in the 4.5 billion years of rock beneath it. The second signature is radioactive. Beginning in 1945 and accelerating through the atmospheric nuclear weapons testing of the Cold War, we distributed highly unnatural radioactive isotopes, primarily plutonium-239 and cesium-137, uniformly across the entire planet. These isotopes do not exist in nature in these measurable quantities. They are the exclusive, violent byproduct of artificial fission reactions. They are now permanently embedded in a microscopic layer of soil, sediment, and ice, wrapping the globe like a chemical tattoo. Plutonium-239 has a half-life of roughly 24,000 years, meaning that even tens of millions of years from now, a future geochemist with a sensitive enough mass spectrometer could detect the faint, lingering anomalous isotopic ratios. Stratigraphers have formally proposed this radioactive layer as the golden spike, the official permanent marker defining the start of the Anthropocene epoch. The third signature is written in absolute biological silence. The current rate of species extinction on this planet is estimated to be between 100 and 1,000 times the normal natural background rate. We are completely reshaping the biosphere, stripping away habitats and collapsing ecosystems. For a paleontologist drilling into the rock 50 million years from now, this will not look like a gradual transition. It will appear in the fossil record as a sudden, dramatic reduction in biological diversity, a violent gap in the strata that perfectly matches the scale and severity of the 5 great mass extinctions in Earth's history. But the fourth signature is the most damning and the most terrifying. It is the signature of our engines. For over 150 years, we have been mining ancient, stored biological life, coal, oil, and natural gas, and burning it. Because these fossil fuels are organic in origin, they preferentially contain the lighter carbon-12 isotope. As we combust billions of tons of this material, we are rapidly injecting massive volumes of carbon-12 directly into the atmosphere, causing a severe, measurable negative shift in the global carbon isotope ratio. That carbon dissolves into the oceans, is absorbed by the shells of marine organisms, and sinks to the seabed, permanently locking our industrial exhaust into the accumulating limestone. If you look at these 4 signatures together, a rapid carbon isotopic excursion driven by burned organic material, a massive extinction event, anomalous trace metals and synthetic molecules, and a possible radioactive whisper, you are no longer just looking at the future. You are looking directly into the deepest, darkest mirror of the ancient past. Because we have seen this exact chemical footprint before. Bring the narrative full circle back to the 56 million-year-old crime scene of the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. The PETM features a massive, geologically instantaneous injection of carbon. It features a devastating deep-sea mass extinction and a violent reshuffling of the terrestrial food web. And most importantly, the carbon that flooded the ancient atmosphere carries the exact same, unmistakable biological carbon-12 isotopic fingerprint that is currently pouring out of our own smokestacks and exhaust pipes. We are currently replicating the precise chemical fingerprint of the most mysterious mass extinction event in Earth's history. The rate of our carbon release, the isotopic signature of that carbon, the rising global temperatures and the acidifying oceans are not just analogous to the PETM, they are chemically identical to it. We are writing the exact same entry into the exact same geological ledger, with instruments sensitive enough to watch ourselves do it in real time. When researchers run the theoretical models to determine what an advanced, industrialized civilization would look like after 50 million years of tectonic crushing and planetary recycling, the output generated by the models perfectly matches the data we find in the PETM boundary layer. And simultaneously, the output generated by those models perfectly matches the data we are embedding into the crust right now. Imagine an intelligent species evolving on this planet 50 million years from now. Their world, transformed beyond recognition by shifting continents and deep time, is stable. They build instruments, they study the deep past, they drill core samples into the ancient ocean floor and pull up a thin, strange layer of rock corresponding to our present day. They will find the carbon-12 spike, the mass extinction, the lingering traces of rare earth metals, and the ghost of our radioactive isotopes. They will study our layer exactly the way we study the PETM. They will try to calculate the volume of carbon and attribute it to melting methane hydrates, or massive volcanic eruptions, or shifts in the Earth's orbit. They will realize the natural math does not perfectly balance, and they will leave a gap in their academic literature. The question isn't just whether an advanced civilization existed before us. The terrifying question is, 50 million years from now, when the next intelligent species finds our thin, chemical layer of rock, will they assume we were just another natural disaster?